A mere 30 years ago, the US was Africa's biggest trading partner, while China was a reclusive economic backwater. Today, China has surpassed the US and continues to gain more influence in Africa. This has raised a lot of eyebrows, especially in the West, and has led to China's motives in Africa being questioned. But these suspicions of China by the West are not based on any form of benevolence or concern for Africa. It's just made to look that way. But there's more to it than that. So, in 2013, China launched its Belt and Road Initiative, which has undertaken massive infrastructure and economic development projects across the globe. In Africa, according to the Observer Research Foundation, 53 out of the 54 countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The only country that's not part of this initiative is the Kingdom of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. But this is not necessarily surprising because Eswatini is the only African country that still has diplomatic relations with the Republic of China in Taiwan and not the People's Republic of China on the mainland. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, China has funded and built a lot of infrastructure in Africa. This includes schools, hospitals, power plants, and parliament buildings. It includes about 1,000 bridges, close to 100 ports, up to 100,000 kilometers of road, and more than 10,000 kilometers of railroads. But in the midst of all of this, there has been claims, especially from the West, that China is doing all of this as part of a grand scheme to trick or even force Africa into economic dependence. And the term or phrase that's usually used to describe this is debt trap diplomacy.
We call this a debt trap.
To support this debt trap claim, an example is usually drawn from the case of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. In 2008, Sri Lanka took out a loan from China for the construction of this port. After a few years of operation, the Hambantota port had incurred serious losses and the Sri Lankan government was struggling to pay China back. So in 2017, the two governments reached an agreement in which China would take over or lease the Hambantota port for 99 years. Admittedly, that doesn't sound great for Sri Lanka, and it definitely fits the narrative of a debt trap. But over the last few years, it's become clear that the Hambantota affair was not some sort of elaborate scheme by Beijing to entrap Sri Lanka. China didn't approach Sri Lanka and suggest the Hambantota project. It's quite the contrary, in fact. Furthermore, there were no geostrategic motivations here. This was a commercial project that the Sri Lankan government mismanaged and had to find a bailout for. They were not forced into some sort of debt and equity swap. Now, moving back to Africa, it's important to understand that the idea of a debt trap is often used by the West to try and dissuade African countries from working and partnering with China. The US, for example, often portrays itself as the better partner for Africa instead of China. But this is all just part of an ongoing competition for political and economic influence on the continent. Despite America's efforts, China-Africa relations seem to be thriving. African countries continue to work and partner with China, and the Belt and Road Initiative projects on the continent are a testimony to this. And this is not to say that African countries are no longer working or partnering with the US, or that they have picked a side between China and the US. What is clear, however, is that African leaders do not wish to be told who they can or cannot work with. As the former chairperson of the African Union, Macky Sall, once said, "When we talk, we're often not listened to, or in any case, not with enough interest. This is what we want to change. And let no one tell us no, don't work with so and so, just work with us. We want to work and trade with everyone." This brings us to the fundamental difference in the US approach to Africa and that of China. The US has been criticized for dealing with Africa as one place, instead of 54 different countries, each with its own unique circumstances. Moreover, the US has been said to look at Africa as a problem to be solved, as opposed to a place for opportunity. There is a general lack of respect in the way that the US deals with African countries. African leaders are pretty much told what policies the US is adopting, and they are expected to just follow suit without any form of meaningful engagement. This was more or less the case during the US Africa Leaders Summit, which Joe Biden hosted in December 2022. Dr. Arikana Chihombori is a former African Union ambassador to the US. Listen to what she had to say about the US Africa Leaders Summit in her interview with Al Jazeera.
What really is behind the failure of effective engagement with Africa is the disrespect of the Africans. That's where the problem begins. It's always the United States setting the agenda, the United States setting the policies, and the United States telling the Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat the Africans fairly, the United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia, to all other nations, because without respecting the Africans, without treating the Africans as equal, without understanding that exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue, this meeting, this summit, is going to be yet another gathering with no outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit.
These are possible reasons why many African countries have turned to China, despite the US trying to portray itself as the better fit. Now, let's move on to China's approach to Africa. One of the notable things about China's foreign investment and aid is that it's no strings attached, at least not in the same way as that of the West. Unlike the US and other Western lending institutions, China's trade and loans come with no requirements or conditions on issues such as human rights, democracy, good governance, and so forth. Just like Xi Jinping said at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation back in 2015, China supports the settlement of African issues by Africans the African way. That's a very loaded statement, which no doubt would have been appreciated by the African leaders who are time and again given lectures by the West on how to run their own countries. This is why China has pulled ahead of the US and other Western powers when it comes to opportunities for investment in African infrastructure. Going back to the issue of debt trap diplomacy. There is no doubt that in the rush to gain favor with African countries and to give them loans, some of China's earlier investments may not have made as much profit as was projected. Similarly, in their excitement over Chinese funding for infrastructure, some African countries took on projects that ended up being unaffordable and therefore having to be settled by debt. But that on its own is not indicative of a debt trap. If anything, it shows poor planning and a lack of foresight on the part of China and the African countries involved. But there's no master plan by Beijing to trick African countries into taking loans that they can't pay back and as a result become beholden or even taken over by China. I get it. China has pumped billions of dollars into Africa, over $155 billion in the last 20 years. But the idea that African countries are falling into a debt trap is problematic, to say the least. It's kind of an insult to African leaders because it implies that somehow they are not sophisticated enough to take care of themselves or their countries for that matter. It takes away their agency in all of this. But China's interest and investment in Africa has nothing to do with a debt trap. On a political level, it could be argued that China does this to buy allies so that African countries might vote with China at the UN General Assembly. On an economic level, China is just investing in new and booming economies in Africa so that they may get in on that growth and benefit something. It's no different from what their Western counterparts have been doing. As for the terms and conditions of these Chinese loans, African leaders should be left alone to decide for themselves if these are favorable for them and their people or not. African countries are not unsuspecting victims that have to be saved or warned by good Samaritans on the dangers of taking money from China. If China has got a trick up its sleeves, then the Africans will see through it, just as they see through what the US and Britain and France and other powers have done and continue to do in Africa. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I'm Simon Bayani, and this is Africa in Retrospect. Cheers for now.